We're going to carry on this afternoon with a man who has spent something like 40 years researching the evolutionary approaches to psychopathologists. Professor Paul Gilbert, who is Professor of Psychology at Derby, is the man who is responsible for developing compassion-focused psychotherapy, which is actually based on evolutionary understanding. And on the strength of that, he's gone on to develop the Compassionate Mind Foundation, and recently he was awarded the OBE for his outstanding services to mental health care. And I know he's a very entertaining speaker, and so he's just the man to wake us up after we've got into the relaxed stage after tea. So, Professor Gilbert, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to this wonderful meeting. It's a fantastic initiative, actually. And of course, Riyadh and I go back to the early 80s or whenever, when we were in Norwich together, so it's a long union. So it's a delight to be here. And I've always had a passion for evolutionary approaches to our suffering, really. And I've changed my talk a little bit because, as you know, there's been the sad passing of John Price. Now, I met John Price in the 80s, and John was a wonderful mentor to me. And so I'm going to just touch on some of his work as we go through. So we will certainly be focusing on compassion a little later in the talk, but I'm going to talk on some of his work. So what I'm going to do today is really have a look at some basic evolutionary concepts. I'm going to think a little bit about the relationship between compassion and cruelty, because paradoxically, in order to understand the potential for compassion, you have to understand the dark side, our dark side, compassion for cruelty. Talk a little bit about old and new brains, to do with the way in which we have a capacity for thinking and self-conscious insight that changes our capacity for utilizing some of our inner motivational systems. Look at the relationship between competitive psychology, caring psychology, and then focus in on therapy. So all of you in this audience will be familiar that we are part of an evolutionary journey called the flow of life, and that this gentleman was very responsible for changing the whole nature of the way in which we thought about the nature of our being, how we came into being. Although he didn't focus primarily to begin with on humanity, that came later, he focused on the ways in which a variety of species came to be on the planet. Darwin didn't know much about genes, of course, because they were in the future, but we now know that genes are that which create bodies to carry them around, and this is all of Richard Dawkins stuff and all of the kin selection and so on. We know that bodies are short-lived, subject to disease and injury, so bodies don't last very long. They are short-term vehicles for genes, and in order for them to be those short-term vehicles, those bodies need to do things. So genes need to build bodies that are orientated to pursue certain life tasks, certain motivations, with certain motives. So that means then that there are two fundamental evolutionary pressures: the pressures of survival, actually just getting through life, which if you work in the NHS is getting more and more difficult, and that involves feeding behavior, defending against predators, building shelters, and so on. And then the other branch of evolutionary pressures is the pressure to leave your genes behind, which is reproduction, and that involves the whole issues of sexual competition and parental investment, and also the capacity to build alliances. And these really are the two streams that give rise to the development and the evolution of phenotypes, and those phenotypes have within them different patterns of motives and emotions, ways of paying attention, ways of behaving. And as you see in the middle, the environment plays a huge role in how those phenotypes mature. So as has been mentioned earlier, we know the whole issue about epigenetics and so on. So let's have a look at this whole issue about new and old minds now. Now, again, what we know is in the flow of life, there's a whole range of adaptations that take place, and not all of the adaptations that take place are to the good. The ladies in the room will know quite well that the adaptation of upright walking where the legs came together, also narrowed your birth canal. So that's good because you have our arms free and so on and so on. But unfortunately, it means that human females have the most dangerous and painful births of all primates. So that's an example of a trade-off where you have an advantage in one area, but actually it causes problems in other areas. And we know that there are a whole range of constraints and trade-offs. There are a whole range of contexts and triggers that can push adaptive function into maladaptive form. We were speaking just earlier, a colleague was speaking just earlier about the whole issue of contextual match and mismatching, and the questions about the kinds of environments that we're living in and how that impinges on our minds. Now, one of the areas where there's a huge number of trade-offs is in the relationship between what we call old brain functions. These are the basic motivations that have been laid down over many millions of years, such as for harm avoidance, food, sex, caring status. We also have a whole range of emotions, of course, particularly those for anger and anxiety, various behavioral dispositions, fight, flight, and so on. And of course, we share these with many, many, many other mammals, and that's a little bit sad for them, really, because they've been used as experimental subjects, so we could look at their brains, look at their genes, look at their neurochemistry. Now, if it had turned out that they were fundamentally different to us, then all of that information, well, it wouldn't have been useless, but it wouldn't have been as useful as it has. This continuity of form is very important. But then about 2 million years ago, maybe a bit later, a bit earlier, humans began a journey, or our ancestors began a journey of developing a whole range of new brain competencies for language and self-monitoring. We became capable of monitoring just about anything. So you'll never see a chimpanzee sitting under a tree taking their pulse. Oh my God, that's so fast, you know. Or looking into their reflection in the lake. God, have I put on weight? I mean, that's just terrible. Or worrying about the fact they have flatulence and that's going to put all the other chimpanzees off. Humans can monitor anything, internal pains, and they can attribute all kinds of reasons for those pains, but they can also monitor their feelings, their thoughts, their behaviors, whether they're doing well and they're not doing well. So this means that this new brain is really a major game changer. It's a game changer because it can be stimulated by our underlying motivational systems, but it can also stimulate those systems. So that it's a two-way street. So imagine, for example, a zebra running away from a lion. This is a modern technology one. What happens when the zebra gets away, of course, is that they will calm down quite quickly, because once the stimulus is no longer in the sensory field, they can't smell it, see it, or hear it, then that's the end of the game. There's nothing to activate the amygdala. But for humans, because we have a new brain, we can keep the activation of the threat switched on, because we can start to ruminate. We can imagine the worst. Even if we'd got away, we might start to think, can you imagine if I'd been caught? What's it like to be eaten by a lion? Can you imagine having your throat ripped out? Oh my God, it's just awful. Okay, so you just play it again and again and again. And we know that many people who have various forms of psychological difficulty, they get trapped in these loops. And of course, that's the basis for all kinds of therapies, such as the cognitive behavior therapy, to try to understand the nature of these loops, because these loops stimulate a whole range of internal physiological systems and motivational systems. We also know that culture can drive these loops, so that our values and so forth can be highly stimulated by the kinds of cultures and social niches in which we are involved in. And Martin talked a little bit about that in terms of life history. Life history is partly influenced by genes, but certainly influenced by the social niche in which you are in which you grow up. So whether you're in an investing, caring, supporting, low-threat niche, or in a low-vesting, hostile, threatening niche, will have a big impact on how these loops develop in your mind. So you can take all of these old motivational systems for feeding, harm avoidance, and what happens when you put them through the filter of human brain competencies is that you get a whole new range of potential profiles. And these profiles can be very pro-social, neutral, or they can be quite antisocial. The fact of the matter is that humans are potentially one of the nastiest most destructive species that have ever walked this planet. Because we have a capacity for the most horrendous of wars. We can be tribal to the nth degree. We can be greedy. We can be abusive of other people. The history of slavery is horrendous. The history of torture is horrendous. The history of sadistic enjoyment is horrendous. The Roman Games went on for 700 years. In the first 3 months of the opening of the Colosseum, 10,000 people died for entertainment. And this is interesting because if you went back and you found all these Roman individuals who were desperately looking forward to Saturday to go and watch the games and watch people being brutally killed, basically, would you regard them as having sadistic personality disorder? See, it's tricky when you think about how culture brings out these different aspects to us. But equally, this is the point, we are a species of extremes. We also have the potential to use our intelligence for peace, for creating fairness, for medicine. We've rid the world, well, not people in this room maybe, but medicine has rid the world of smallpox. I mean, that's an amazing thing to have been able to do. Think of anesthetics, the invention of anesthetics. What a wonderful invention. Medicine has some wonderful inventions. This is humanity at its best, right? So we can do some fantastic things. So we are a species of extremes because we have a brain that allows us to focus on the dark side or the benevolent side. And it's the same for within us as well. We can use our minds in such a way that we become self-critical and stressed and ruminative and angry, or we can train our minds to be coping, to be encouraging, to be self-supporting, validating, and so forth. So the first point I want to get across to you is that, yes, we can begin to understand some of the roots of human suffering in early formations of phenotypes and their motivational systems, but we also need to understand how new brain competencies have changed the game quite significantly, and how new brain competencies interact with these underlying motivational physiological systems. So I'm going to just take a little bit of a diversion now because I want to talk a little bit about John's ideas. There are basically two major phenotypes that John Price and Anthony Stevens and others were concerned with, particularly in the early 80s. This was the relationship between competitive behavior and caring behavior. Now, Riyad mentioned the 1995 book, 96 book, Evolutionary Psychiatry, where they sort of outlined this idea of these two motivational systems. And the key thing to remember with motivational systems is that motivational systems are that which organizes our mind. In clinical psychology, where I am, we're constantly hammering the issue of motivational processing because with the cognitive revolution, motivational processing systems have been very much sidelined. But what we're trying to do in compassion focused therapy is to put motivation at the center of understanding how our minds work. So in 1998, I published this book called Human Nature and Suffering, which was really to highlight the fact that a lot of human suffering is rooted in the way that our brains are made and our motivational systems work. And John and Stephen amplified that and built on some of those ideas as well. The point about it is to understand then that a motivational system is organizing your mind. It has to organize how you attend to things, what you attend to, the way you think, your behavior, your emotions, the kinds of things you're going to be fantasizing. So if you have a compassionate orientation, then that's going to have a very different organization of these different competencies of mind than if you have a competitive one. So this is pretty straightforward, nothing too much in that. But what's interesting is that if you have a look at the competitive psychology, a competitive motivational system, then when you engage with that, you also stimulate a whole range of other processes. For example, you stimulate interest in social status. People will use judgment systems of social comparison. You can get into low trust or envy. You're more likely to have bullying and narcissism, self-criticism. All of these are associated with environments that are very competitive. Where you have got these high competitive environments, these are some of the issues that are associated with them. So John had the idea that actually one of the functions of depression was to help individuals who have been defeated to downgrade their positive affect so that they no longer get into conflicts with the dominant. So they are then allowed to stay within the group. And this required them to show that they were literally out of action. So animals who are in conflict situations and get defeated and need to accommodate themselves to a lower status or a lowest rank need to do certain things. They need to downgrade their positive affect to induce disengagement and avoid further injury and loss of and harm, and signal that to others. So they've got to be seen to be out of action. This was John's idea. Also at the time, Keith Dixon and others were talking about the fact that what happens if you're defeated in a situation you can't get away from? So if you're defeated but you can leave the field and go somewhere else and try again, that's not nearly as pathogenic as if you're defeated but you can't get out. So these are two key domains that we wanted to explore, and so we developed measures to explore them. Based on John's model, we developed the defeat scale. So this is questions like, I have sunk to the bottom of the ladder, I feel defeated by life. And for entrapment, these are questions like, I'm in a situation I feel trapped in, I have a strong desire to escape from things in my life. So very interested in the whole process of what is called arrested defenses. That is, individuals are in flight mode, the flight system is activated, but it's blocked, so they can't get away. They're wanting to get away, but they can't get away. And this touches a little bit on learned helplessness, but there's much more of an evolutionary understanding about the processes involved here. And what we find is that, as you can see from these correlations, this is based on a depressed group, BDI, hopelessness, HP is hopelessness, and A and H is anhedonia. They're very highly correlated with entrapment. And if we look at the BDI, Beck Depression Inventory, hopelessness and anhedonia, again, they're very highly correlated with defeat. So these defeat states, this feel I've been defeated and so on and so on, this seems to be really quite important in depression. Here's another study we did. And you can see that in the SEM, structured equation model, defeat is the big driver of anhedonia. So in 2011, by 2011, there was a large number of studies now that had used our scales and had used other measures to explore this model that John Price had put forward, the role of defeat. And lo and behold, it turns out it's highly predictive. The sense of being defeated and trapped are highly predictive of a whole range of difficulties such as depression, anxiety, and suicide. Now, some of the other key vulnerabilities that are related to social rank are to do with social comparison, feeling inferior to others, submissive behavior, the readiness to engage in submission as a defense, okay, not to be assertive. Social context, this idea about how one lives in the mind of the other. External shame is the feeling that you are, other people look down on you, that other people see you as inferior, and this competing to avoid inferiority. So in terms of the data on anhedonia, then what we have is that social comparison, submissive behavior, and external shame are linked to these variables in both these populations, depression in both these populations. So anhedonia is linked to feeling inferior, submissive behavior, and thinking that other people look down on you in both depressed and non-depressed populations. But the interesting thing is you can compete for a lot of reasons. One is you compete to be superior and better than others, or you can compete in order to avoid inferiority, falling behind. Many media competitions these days, interestingly enough, shows are now focused not on the winners, but they're focused week after week after week on who are we going to reject, who are we going to kick out. So we, again, developed a measure to look at this. To be valued, I strive to succeed. I have to strive to succeed. Life is a competition. People compare me to others to see if I match up. And we call those kind of ideas insecure striving, whereas secure striving would be I'm striving, I'm wanting to do well for the thing in itself. Others will accept me if I fail. I don't feel under pressure to prove myself. You are loved for what you are, not what you achieve. And you won't be surprised to find out. And also we looked at people's experience of losing out, the feeling of being passively rejected, and also actively rejected. And we find that this striving to avoid inferiority, this insecure striving, is highly linked to these domains. And for depression, they're secure, feeling secure, I'm okay, I can, if I fail, it doesn't so matter. This is linked to feeling relatively okay compared to others, a low level of submissive behavior, and not believing other people look down on you. But if you're an insecure striver, you're striving to avoid being rejected, you're striving to try and prove yourself, then you do tend to see yourself as inferior, you're more likely to be submissive, and you certainly see other people as looking down on you. And it's the same for stress, anxiety, and depression. So we know then that this striving, this competitiveness, is partly in depressed. The depressed dimension is I'm just competing because I have to prove myself, otherwise I get kicked off the truck, right? So this is quite important. We think we've got a little bit of data that narcissists do compete to be superior, but your depressed group are not doing that. They are running as hard as they can and comparing themselves to others and submitting in order to avoid being rejected. We also wondered if it was competitive or caring behavior that was an issue. So we developed a measure that asked people about caring. So if you ask depressed people, do you think you're trustworthy? Do you think you're a caring person? Do you think you're the kind of person other people can turn to? 9 times out of 10, people will say, yeah, I'm a trustworthy person. So in terms of their caring behavior, they do not see themselves as inferior. But if you ask them, do you think you're as competent as other people? Do you think you're attractive as other people? They'll say, no. Other people are much more competent than me, and they're much more capable than me. So it's only in the competitive dimension that inferiority, they don't feel inferior when it comes to caring. And I will look at that in a moment. So one of the interesting things, I think, is that in terms of mismatches of cultural context, is we have an abnormal form and an abnormal intensity of competitiveness. And that's something that I would love to talk about. But let's now move on to the next issue. So if people have got trapped in the competitive motivational system, struggling to compete, to prove themselves, to show themselves, they're comparing themselves, is it possible that you can switch them out of that motivational system and switch them into a caring system? And what would happen if you do? So why would caring have evolved? See, why wouldn't it all be each against each? Well, Martin touched on this, so I'm not going to go into this. But basically, we know that there are 2 types of breeding strategy, slight variations on this. There's an R strategy, which is what Martin was talking about in terms of the fast maturational strategy. But then there's a K strategy, where you have fewer offspring are produced, but you invest in them. You have time to invest in them. So recently, scientific focus has been on the forms of caring and altruism, asking how they can evolve. How can caring evolve? So parental investment and cooperation are evolved motives and strategies, and because they are evolved motivation strategies, they have a physiological architecture. In other words, the brain has had to evolve a whole suite of physiological systems that will allow those behaviors to manifest, that allows those kinds of calculations to be done. So firstly then, caring arises because it increases survival of offspring. That's called parental investment. Also, if you care for your friends, they're going to maybe care for you. So it's quite important. If I go hunting and I know that if I get lost, people will come looking for me, my preparedness to hunt and to share is going to be much greater than if I think, well, if I get lost, they're going to think, thank God for that. That's one less mouth to feed. It's got rid of Gilbert. All right. So this idea of the ability to trust others in small hunter-gatherer groups is very important in terms of developing altruism, and you can fit that into reciprocal altruism, altruistic models, and so on. But we also know that humans actually cared for their sick, and that the archaeological record shows that from about 1 million years ago, people were surviving with broken bones and all kinds of diseases, and they could only have survived if they were being looked after. So this is really quite important. What's also important is our capacity to respond to distress. Now, interestingly enough, distress call responsiveness probably first evolved as self-protection. So Jake Pansket made this point that animals respond to the distress signals of others by running away. So when one bird starts squawking in distress, or when an animal is screaming because they've been caught by a predator, all of these, their conspecifics just disappear, right? It's like, I'm out of here, you know. There's a lion around, I'm gone, right? So it's very interesting that distress sensitivity in a conspecific was a warning. So at some point, that signal of distress had to turn around so the individuals would actually move towards that which was distressed, and that really does depend upon who is signaling the distress. So if it's kin related, then it's in your interest, particularly if it's your own offspring, to go and see if there's anything you can do to help them. And we know now that even crocodiles will hear the cause of their infants coming out of the nest, and they will carry them to the water, because the space between the hatching of the egg and the water is very dangerous. It's when the predators are around, so this gives them an advantage. So here's an example where the call of the infant produces this behavior, and so on. So individuals then, particularly parents, begin to start to be able to pay attention to the distress calls and the needs of their infants, and to some degree start to fulfill those needs. And over evolutionary time, this becomes more and more complex, and the signals become more and more complex. So basically we know then that a species without attachment, only about 1 or 2% of them will make it to survive, and threats comes from all kinds of positions, all kinds of places. Caring behavior, or that looking after another body, another gene-carrying body, here the infant and the parent will seek closeness rather than dispersion. So if you're a turtle, and apparently that's according to Steve Porges, that's our ancestor. If you're a turtle, you have to be mobile from the word go and get off the beach as quickly as you can. Whereas if you are a mammal, you need to stay close to your protector. So there are a whole suite of physiological systems changing in the brain in order to stop the dispersion and to create the connecting of parent and child. And we also know that this suite of interactions, particularly with the mammals and primates, has a soothing, calming quality. So this is important. It's not just providing food, it's not just providing protection, but the interaction between the parent and the child now regulates a whole range of emotional dispositions in that child. The capacity to soothe that child's distress is absolutely quite fundamental. The child cannot self-regulate their emotions. That has to be done from the outside, and that's particularly true for human children. So the thing that what Martin was talking about earlier is extremely important, because right from the word go, children are having their their epigenetic potentials, if you want, and their brains developed according to the experience of being soothed by another. And those children who are not soothed by others, or who are left to be self-regulating, these individuals mature in slightly different ways. So there we are. We also know that the positive emotions shared between parent and child has a major impact on the development of affiliative and emotional pathways in the child's brain. We know, for example, that children whose parents do not engage with them in playful, friendly, affectionate ways, these children's brains develop in slightly different ways. They have emotional and cognitive delays. Tragically, depressed mums who tend to present blank faces to their kids, these kids tend to have more developmental delays. So we know then, and we've been mentioning earlier the work of John Bowlby, that proximity seeking, the desire to be close to, that's one of the fundamental that's one of the fundamental adaptations in the brain, different to the turtle. The seeking out, the closeness seeking behavior is part of attachment, is part of the early caring behavior. Secondly, the ability to provide a secure base from which the infant will go on to explore, and should the infant get into difficulties, they always return back to the secure base. But the secure base is also that which encourages the child to explore. Okay, so that also has this other aspect of encouraging the child to go out and explore the world. And to act as a safe haven, which comes back again to this whole issue of having a soothing capacity, this capacity to soothe distress. Now, this is very important because we now know that these capacities for soothing distress are not the same as just removing threat. There are specific signals that signal soothing, and these signals stimulate parasympathetic system and so on, as I will explore in a moment. But we're beginning to get a feel for the evolution of caring and the kind of mechanisms that the caring system, the caring processes are activating in the human brain. And these are social signals, and they're driven by this particular, like facial expressions, voice tones, physical contact, and so forth. So when we started to do our compassion work, we began to look at the awareness of we used Vogel's model, which was the importance of the caring involves awareness of the need to be self-nurturing, a motivation to nurture, understanding of what is needed, an expression of that, and the feedback if that's not working very well. So we now have reasonable models about what caring behavior actually is. And notice this is completely different from the kind of processes that you see in competitive behavior. These motivational systems, these attentional focuses, these physiological systems that underpin caring are quite different from that of competitiveness. So this is the John Bowlby thing. We also know that from Cohort we have other things that are important. So basically then what we know is that the parasympathetic system has become myelinated, and the vagal nerve in particular is very sensitive. The vagal brake on the ANS is very, very sensitive to affiliative signals, voice tones, facial expressions. This activates this vagus nerve. And we also know that breathing, diaphragmatic breathing, can activate the vagal nerve. Okay, and I don't need to go into this to you. What you'll know is that that link between the parasympathetic and the sympathetic produces what we call heart rate variability, and when those systems are in balance, we have positive heart rate variability, and for the most part, there are some exceptions, the higher your heart rate variability, the more emotionally regulated you are, the more social you are, and the more caring you are in general. So being cared for, we know, then being cared for has a whole lot of impacts. It affects gene expression, it affects stress reactivity, it affects the way in which the APA system works, it affects your immune function. Children who grew up in caring environments, immune function differs from those who grew up in stressful environments. It affects the maturation of your frontal cortex, it affects your illness, your vulnerability to illness and recovery. It affects your core values, self-identity. So a whole range of things. We now know that caring behavior is fundamental to the way in which our brains and our bodies are organized to promote optimum well-being. So let's now look at the last part of the talk, which is going from caring to compassion. The fact is that mammals care for their offspring and for each other to a degree. But what turns caring into compassion is this new brain stuff. So you wouldn't talk about, a rat licking its pup or rescuing it as compassion. Compassion requires caring motivation when guided by new brain competencies. That's what gives rise to compassion. So the point about it is that caring in humans is now under the influence of powerful cognitive and reflective processes for insight, reciprocal feedback between cognition and motivation, and crucially important is, is the cortex. So compassion now then has a basic definition, which is sensitivity to suffering in self and others with a commitment to try to relieve and prevent it. Sometimes compassion is regarded as related to kindness. Now, kindness is about slightly different, and we've just finishing a study looking at the distinction between compassion and kindness. But for compassion, it is this sensitivity to distress. Remember, that's where the whole caring system started off, sensitivity to the distress of the infant, right? So there are two psychologies here. Firstly is the ability to turn towards that which is painful or difficult in yourself or in others, and that requires courage. And then the second psychology is actually learning what to do. So when you're thinking about compassion-focused therapy, those are going to be the key things that we will be working with people, their ability to have the courage to engage with their distress and teaching them how to self-regulate. In addition, compassion-focused therapy focuses on developing an identity, a motivational system, because we're wanting to switch people out of the competitive system into this compassion system. So this is about developing a sense of self that is committed to not carelessly or purposely causing harm and suffering. So certainly in the Buddhist traditions, which I've been involved with for many years, this idea of what is called Bodhichitta, which is the idea is that I will, to the best of my ability, not deliberately or carelessly cause suffering, and that relates to what is called the Golden Rule. And we can do caring motivation when it's put through our new brain stuff means that we can have sympathy, empathy, we learn distress tolerance, we learn courage and wisdom. This is what gives us the abilities to enact compassion. Okay, so it's important this because sometimes people confuse empathy with compassion. Empathy is a competency, it's not a motive. It's very important that we understand the distinction between motives, emotions, competencies. So you can use empathy for benevolent or malevolent ends. Okay, some psychopaths are very good at empathy. What they don't have is caring intention, caring motivation. The caring motivational systems in the psychopath is well and truly off. But they can be empathic, they can understand, and they can perspective take. Okay, I'm going to go through this quite quickly now because time is moving on. What we also know is that there are a series, beg your pardon. There are a series of facilitators and inhibitors to compassion. So, and this is true for nearly every motivational system. For example, think of sexuality or think of eating. It's easier to have sex with somebody you like than somebody you don't. It's easier to eat food you like than food you don't. It's easier to be compassionate to people you like than people you don't. Okay, it's easier to be compassionate if you know what you're doing than you don't. It's easier to be compassionate if you think you deserve it or they deserve it than you think they don't, and so on and so on. So there are lots of blocks, and Martin was talking earlier about fears of compassion, and many of our clients have a lot of these inhibitors. They don't like themselves, they don't really know how to be compassionate, they don't think they deserve compassion, they're very poor at empathizing and mentalizing themselves, and so on. Okay, so, whoops. What we also know is that compassion, if you stimulate this compassion motivational system and you practice it, it increases happiness, it improves well-being, it improves creativity, it changes physiological systems, it improves ethics in social circumstances. Oops, gone the wrong way. Sorry. Imagine that you have two people in your organization. This is some of the social stuff. One is threat-focused and competitive, the other is affiliative. That's going to have an impact on how their mind works, the kind of things they're going to be thinking about, the way they interact with their job role, the way in which they operate in terms of their teams, whether they can create supportive, integrated, cohesive teams, the way they will be as managers, and the way their organization, led by them, will impact on ecologies and so on, and society. There's a whole lot of data now coming out, but what happens if you do compassion training within organizations? And what you find is that the organization tends to move towards quality, not quantity. They encourage bottom-up problem solving rather than top-down problem solving. They enable client and company loyalty, creativity, mutually supportive environments. They have lower sickness rates, lower bullying, and they have an interest in developing ethics. In other ways, the exact opposite of how the NHS is managed. Okay, here's another study, which, so just a little bit, go through a few studies for you, and then we will come to an end. So let's think about if you can activate, what happens if people have a compassionate motivational system working for them. So this is some work by Jennifer Croker and her colleagues, Cambalio. So they looked at compassionate and self-image goals. And in self-image, self-compassion goals, they would have things like, in the last week, what were you trying to do? And so compassion goals would be supportive of others, have compassion for others' mistakes and weaknesses, avoid doing anything that would be harmful to others. You see, there it is, harm avoidance, not deliberately harming, making a positive difference to somebody. Whereas ego goals, self-image goals, were In the last week, I've been trying to get others to recognize or acknowledge my positive qualities. You'll convince others that you're right, avoid showing your weakness. So those are all what we would call competitive goals. So you've got this competitive, trying to avoid rejection, inferiority, trying to prove yourself, versus compassion goals. And you won't be surprised to find that average compassion goals predicted closeness, clear and connected feelings, and increased social support and trust over the semester. Self-image goals attenuated these effects. So if individuals are having compassionate goals in these environments, they're actually creating supportive environments around them, whereas individuals who are pursuing self-interest goals, self-image goals, then they are not doing that. We also have a lot of data now that compassion goals is associated with well-being, whereas these competitive, ego, defensive goals predict loneliness, afraid and confused feelings. We also know that practicing compassion impacts on the frontal cortex. Loving kindness meditation increases positive emotions. Okay. Compassion meditation improves the immune system. Helping others helping others with compassion predicts reduced mortality, specifically by buffering the association between stress and mortality. So here's just one paper of many, many papers now, that if you teach people, if you focus them, if you guide them into how to develop compassion motivational systems, right, of which there are many, many aspects, remember, distress tolerance, empathy, this desire not to cause suffering and so forth, this really does change a range of physical brain patterns and body patterns. So here's a study by Tanya Singer, who's doing a lot of work. There's a big study going on now looking at how empathy training, how mindfulness training, and how compassion training change different aspects of the brain. So they're looking at those three dimensions. So what about compassion-focused therapy? Get to moving into the last stages now. Well, compassion-focused therapy uses a lot of standard therapeutic interventions, such as guided discovery and so on and so on. But it's unique in certain kinds of ways. Firstly, it is a psychoeducation that talks about evolution. It talks to people about the fact that the brain is very tricky. It's got a lot of glitches and loops and feedback systems that really cause you a lot of trouble. A lot of what's going on in your head is not your fault. Okay? So sometimes with our borderline patients, when we sit them down and we find the right moment, because the right moment is important, to say, look, all this shit that goes on in your head, all this rage, all this stuff, it's not your fault, it's not your fault. And we'll take them through pictures of the brain and show how the brain works and what happens when you have certain kinds of environments and why the emotion systems don't work. And sometimes, patients, we've had patients just sit and cry, particularly if they've done other kinds of therapies where they've been told they've got this dysfunction or that dysfunction or that maladaptive schema or whatever it is. One lady looked at us and she said, all my life, I just thought when God made me, he'd run out of the nice bits. All my life, I was told I was the black sheep. I was just an arsehole of this person, So the point is, a lot of our clients have this deep, ingrained sense that there's something wrong with them. So we say, no. Unfortunately, you're in a particular pattern. Your brain's gone into a pattern through no fault of your own. So what can we do to switch this pattern for you? We have a model of affect regulation which focuses on specifically the focus of affiliative emotion, the practicing of affiliative emotion, and the practice of breathing exercises that are designed specifically to stimulate the vagal nerve. We build compassionate motivations, and we build the sense of a compassionate identity. We use acting techniques to do this as well. We use a lot of techniques, but one of the techniques is to build these acting techniques of practicing. What would it be like if you were at your compassionate self, if you're at your compassionate best? Okay, so you're really angry about this event, but now just breathe slowly and imagine that you're at your compassionate best, at your wisest and your calmest. How would this part of you like to deal with that? So they practice that a lot. We work on self-criticism, and we work a lot with the fears, blocks, and resistances. So here's just one study that we did looking at people with psychosis, because people with psychosis, compassion-focused therapy was designed for the individuals who are difficult. And basically the results show that compassion-focused therapy was associated with no adverse events. We had a low attrition rate and high acceptability. The clients really liked it. Relative to treatment as usual, CFT was associated with greater observed clinical improvement, significant increases in compassion. Relative to TAU, increases in compassion in the CFT group were significantly associated with reductions in depression and in perceived social marginalization. There's now a meta-analysis going on, looking at the impacts of compassion interventions. And so the evolutionary story really is to focus on, so that therapy is, I think, shifting towards what we call neuropsychophysiotherapy, or in other words, we're teaching people practices and helping them train to be able to develop parts of their brain, the frontal cortex, vagal nerve, and so on, which hasn't been operating because they've been so dominated by threat processing and so on. So you're moving from here to compassion, you're moving from the threat-based processing, competing, into compassion processing, right? And compassion is not just about being nice. It's not just taking pain away. It's not submitting to the demands of others. It's not a floozy thing. Compassion is creating the conditions for building the courage, the wisdom, and dedication to face what we need to face and to aspire to be at our best, guided by a concern for well-being of ourselves and others and our impact upon them. So that also has a big ethical issue in... So this is basically the story. This is my last slide. Don't know why that's come up here. The human brain is very tricky. The human brain has the potential to do some very nasty things. The human brain has the potential to cause the individual themselves to suffer greatly, to become depressed, paranoid. It's not a particularly well designed because it wasn't designed. This is an important story for people to understand. Otherwise, if they get the idea that, they're dysfunctional because they're not thinking right, or they got these unresolved conflicts or whatever it is, I think that puts it into a difficult position for some clients. But if they realize, actually, no, this isn't my fault. This is how my brain is, and this is how it's been choreographed because of my life. But if I practice these, I can begin to create different patterns. This is a very hopeful message for people. So evolutionary approaches highlight this problem that the human brain is a mess. Okay, and one of the things that we are pursuing a lot within the evolutionary compassion-focused model is helping people realize that the human brain is potentially a very, very dangerous organ. And human history shows that. Okay, it is not well designed. And one of the problems that it's not a problem, but one of the things we're talking to our medical colleagues is, don't assume because something is not right that something has gone wrong. It's just moved into a pattern which is potentially harmful because of partly design. Not everything that's done that is harmful is a pathology, okay, to self and others. Think of the Roman games. So crucial to our understanding, the evolutionary approach is crucial to understanding the complex link between context and behavioral outcomes and avoiding simplistic and naive notions of cause and change. Okay, so this is really very important. And we were talking earlier with Martin and colleagues that I think all of us in this room would agree that we need to have a much better social psychiatry orientation. The fact of the matter is a lot of what's happening in our culture and has been happening is driving us bonkers. We're all being driven bonkers because it's over-competitive, uninvesting, and all the rest of it. So we need to begin to talk about, you will get mental health if you create mentally healthy environments, but you won't if you don't. So it's as simple as that. So there we are. I think we can be at the forefront of studying the context for stimulating moral, ethical, and compassion orientations to our own minds and those of others. So there we are. Compassion will take on your dark side. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Paul, for a really fascinating talk there, and talking about taking on the dark side. I suppose compassion, we've got a nice group of people, I suppose, largely of liberal disposition, to whom it seems a very reasonable approach to treat other people with compassion, a noble aspiration. But if we look at the broad context now, it looks as though when one sector of society suggests we should be treating people with compassion. People like refugees, economic migrants. What actually seems to be happening in the broader community is that there's a populist rebellion to that and a retreat to perhaps more primitive paranoia and xenophobia, which gets stoked up within the community. And so that the compassion actually can destabilize the even larger, the broader community of which we're a part. So I wonder if you've any thoughts about that.
Yes, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I think and certainly what happened in Germany with Merkel really lost her grip with the whole issue in 2015 when she introduced the idea of we can take 1 million immigrants, and she was sworn out and spat out and all that stuff. So what's very interesting is that when people are under threat, or they themselves are in the competitive situation, particularly if they see themselves as losers, they do not like the idea of therefore sharing with people who are not part of their tribe. And you're quite right, the power of tribalism is enormous, and it's a huge problem because it's done terrible damage to humanity over thousands of years, if you think of all the religious wars and so on and so on. So I don't have any answers, but I think the point that you're making is an extremely important one, that we know that if we can change that organization of our individual minds, but also minds within society, then we will get the impacts that we want. But the question is, how do you do it? So one of my PhDs is starting to look at, and we're looking at this, how do you have compassion for people, how do you teach narcissists to be compassionate? And narcissists don't think compassion is useful. They don't. They can't see the point of it. You know, you have to rely on yourself, and it's what you make of yourself, and you don't want to be bothering about all these other people. So it's a wonderful question. We don't actually know, but we know we need to find out.
Yes, well, with Trump's America and the extremes of Brexit, it seems ever more pressing. But anyway.
Well, I think part of the issue, very interesting, Galbraith said, one of the problems with people who are winners, or they are relatively, they tend to opt out of taking political moves. So what you're left with is the people who are relatively angry and are voting because they're angry how they've been left behind. And that's certainly one of the analysis of the American situation, that person might have won because he appealed to a group of people who felt very left behind and disfranchised and frightened because there was no jobs for them or their children. So the point is, if you stimulate voting out of anger, then you're going to have trouble, which is what we got.
George.
To follow on exactly that point, does Trump has a compassionate motivational system?
Well, let's assume, supposing there was somebody that looked remarkably like Trump, he doesn't appear to have, but he might. But on the surface, his view, I'm sure, would be that he's following what he promised he would do. So from his point of view, he's probably the most compassionate person there is. If you asked him, there's no one as compassionate. Believe me, I'm compassionate, okay? You haven't seen anybody as I'm a genius when it comes to compassion, right? So that's what he would argue, because I'm staying true to what I said I would do. We would have a different view, of course. So the question is, what turns that motivational system on and off? That's a very interesting question.
Riyadh.
Thank you very much, Paul. Really brilliant. I don't know whether you've come across Michael Shermer's book, The Moral Arc. I was just wondering, while you were talking about the I don't know how to put it, the activation of the compassionate system as opposed to the competitive system.
Or tribal, yeah.
Both of which are obviously part of our brain machinery. My question is the compassion-focused therapy, does it rely on the evolution of the cultural evolution of a narrative that can press the right buttons in our compassion system, which, along the lines of what Shermer has suggested, which is that culture develops and culture evolves, and that actually morality evolves, so that the Roman scenario of enjoying the death of 10,000 people on a Saturday night can become unacceptable, and that entertainment becomes more, if you like, ethical, caring of other people's well-being and so forth. Is that what is going on here with the compassion-focused therapy? Is it part of a cultural narrative that has evolved this improved morality? I mean, is this what?
I think it's quite possible. I mean, as you know, the Buddha went on about this 2,500 years. A lot of spirituality traditions, Christianity hold this. So it's not particularly a new story that compassion is important. The point is how it operates.
It wasn't prevalent.
Not prevalent in terms of the masses. We don't send children down the mines anymore, and so on and so on. So I think this is very important. In terms of individuals, I think what we find is there are a number of things. Firstly, that if people, if you measure the heart rate variability, for example, if the vagus isn't working particularly well as a vagal brake on emotion, until you can get that working for them, they're not going to change much. Second point is that we find that often individuals who are quite heartless are partly blocked. They're dissociated from the pain that's happened to them. There's some very interesting work now looking at mirror neurons in people who are callous. And these individuals don't respond to their own distress, let alone other people's. So there's a whole issue about they've learned to dissociate from pain. The question is whether, to what extent that is a learned phenomenon, to what it's a genetic phenomenon. But certainly for our experience is that for some people, if you facilitate a grieving process, there's something in the grieving process that opens up an attachment system again. So we find, certainly with our borderlines, and I've been interested in what Martin thinks about this, until they've been able to grieve for the harm that was done to them and to really feel that sense of loss and yearning to be loved, they're stuck. And then the third thing is for them to have an understanding and an orientation to what they're trying to achieve, the person they're trying to become, the person they want to become, because we suggest, like the Buddha suggests, that by having this orientation that I want to be this kind of person, that's what I'm going to practice to be, that's what guides you. Now this is what youngsters do. I want to be that kind of footballer, or I want to look. So this idea of trying to become something is very important, and by training them of how you can do that, this gives them a guidance as opposed to just become whatever arises in you.
Just behind you, Ryan. Can I just follow from the discussion about the Trump, the Brexit? I think what will make a difference is that if we keep in mind our insights from in-group, out-group dynamics, and what sort of strategies that reduce out-group bias, such as intergroup contact, for example, a mutual differentiation model, so that I accept that you're different, but we are complementing each other rather than we are competitive. Because I think it seems to me, and you can correct me, that when you were talking about the evolution of caring, we're usually talking about at the interpersonal level rather than about group levels.
Yes, I mean, I agree with that. I mean, the Brexit is very interesting, and to some extent, the American election was very interesting in the sense that the articulation of those things weren't in the political dialogue. They weren't in the narrative. I mean, the Labour Party was nowhere. So the way in which the alternative to Brexit was articulated in terms of exactly the things you were saying, that was not really in the narrative, and certainly not in the right-wing press. So it's how do you get that narrative into the discourse of the community? So contact is, of course, important and so forth, but I think we probably need to do a much, much better job in working out how to create discourses that override tribalism, particularly if people are fearful or feel they've missed out or they're unemployed or whatever it is,
Question behind.
It's a thought, really, that came to me during the last part of your talk. Thank you. I mean, one of the things I do professionally is I assess families in child protection proceedings where there's emotional neglect and abuse. And often it's very young parents who have been terribly neglected and abused themselves, but have very little capacity to even be aware of what's happened to them, let alone think about it. And we're often asked to comment on the parent's capacity to be attuned to the child's emotional needs. And we often end up by concluding, until the parent develops the capacity to understand their own emotional needs,
Yes.
they are not going to be able to empathise with their child. I mean, it sounds nice and it sort of feels right, but, it's a good statement, but do you have any thoughts about that?
Yes, I agree entirely with you, and there is increasing evidence for it. Yes, I mean, I haven't put it into this talk, but yes, very much so. Yes, it's true. Yes, but I think, and that's true for many things, isn't it? I mean, for empathy, for many of us, we are limited to a degree. If we hear we can perhaps try to imagine what it's like for somebody who's been tortured or raped or whatever. When I was in America last year at Los Angeles, we were on cultural diversity, and some of the black members of the speakers was talking about white people just do not understand. You say you have empathy for us, but you just do not understand what it's like to be a black person in this country. You just don't get it. You just don't understand what it's like to be constantly stopped by the police or whatever it is. So it's an important question, this, that people can try to imagine whatever it is, but what is it that genuinely facilitates a capacity to understand the other? Certainly our ability to experience those emotions ourselves is one of them. And you're quite right that if parents haven't been able to process those emotions in themselves, and also it's not just the negative emotions but the joyfulness. One of the things you probably know in your work is that the parents don't often have joyful feelings with their children. They don't know how to play with their children, to get joy from their children, just to mess about and have fun, So it's not just the negative emotions, it's the whole spectrum of emotions that can be very difficult for these parents to be able to experience because they've never had them stimulated in them,
Okay, Anne.
I just wondered how you might adapt compassion-focused therapy for those individuals whose brains may not have the same capacity to be compassionate. For instance, people with autistic spectrum disorder who have less ability to be empathic, for example. And I wonder how you approach it in that sense of, the people who've actually grown up from very early on in life with a different sort of brain functioning.
I think it's a brilliant question. So this goes back again to the whole issue of motivation versus competency. So as far as we know, Asperger and autistic spectrum, their caring motivation is okay. I mean, they're not sort of wanting to harm people or something. But it's the competencies that are tricky. So the point is then you have to work out how do you develop competencies. So for example, Mark Baldwin in America has been doing stuff with helping children to have eye contact just in games using, because often autistic children, the eyes are a threat signal. In many species, eye contact is a threat signal. So they respond to eye contact with a threat signal. So just getting them to take an interest in eye contact and then getting them to, or encouraging them to think about what kinds of facial expressions and so forth. Now these are obviously for those individuals who have some capacity for communication, talking, but it's very much at the level of these sort of trainings, really, and working out for that particular person, what do we need to stimulate in order to try to see if we can get this competency working for them.
Because these individuals also have difficulty being compassionate to themselves as well as...
Yes.
Yeah.
But it's a great question. I mean, it's a new field, so it's still developing, really, and we'll see what happens over the next 10 years for those individuals who are taking this trying to get this motivational system, this vagus connection to the frontal cortex, that system working, how you can do that in these different populations, because it's going to be different, different interventions for different people, I think.
Hi. With the recent interest of psilocybin for treatment of treatment-resistant depression and cultivating compassion, is psilocybin activating or enhancing the regions or pathways that are responsible for the new brain?
I would have to hand over to one of my psychiatry colleagues for this. I don't know the answer to that.
Anyone want to volunteer?
Can you repeat the question?
The question was about whether psilocybin is activating the appropriate areas within the brain to stimulate compassion. Is that broadly it? Oh, we've got a volunteer. Brave man.
Sorry, I've written papers on drug use and emotional systems, which Martin has in his textbook. What it does is all the different drugs that we have, most of which until recently were vegetable, plant-based. So you've got tobacco, you've got opiates, you've got alcohol, nicotine, what have you. And a lot of these things are in plants to sort of damage the brain of herbivores or parasites. And of course, human beings take these things and it jiggers up the brain somewhat. Now, it's not an accident that you've got these chemicals which affect brains, because if a herbivore is intoxicated or poisoned, the plant survives. So when you've got, whether it's a mushroom or a tobacco plant or, cannabis, these things are not intended for our good. But human beings have learned if you take a bit of it, they have an effect, the same way as we drink alcohol. And depending on which neurotransmitter or series of neurotransmitters they hit something with a sort of complete blunderbuss effect. So whether or not it changes compassion, I mean, of course, you have the whole argument about psychonauts and shaman using drugs for religious purposes. But whether they genuinely induce some sort of useful compassion is a bit like whether alcohol really does improve social interaction. I think it's a two-edged sword. You're jiggering up the neurotransmitters, blocking them, or being a synthetic transmitter, or whatever you're doing as an agonist or an antagonist. And it's very hard to judge, what the sort of outcome will be when you're doing something that's so extraordinary.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Yes, do you want
There's
to...
just one...
Just to add to that, is that substances like psilocybin allow people to feel intensely, not to see intensely, to have really powerful capacity to be aware of their surroundings. And it's not intention directed. And that's one of the really important things. And it does seem to have very profound effects, actually, on that system. I mean, if I think of my very narcissistic patients, they're very cut off from their feelings and emotions.
Yes.
And things like psilocybin allow them to actually make contact with parts of their brain which they're not allowing themselves.
Do you think that's going to grow? I mean, do you think that's the evidence is coming through now such that will be used more commonly?
Well, people do use it. I mean, not necessarily psilocybin, but they use other substances that make them feel good about other people.
Any final questions? Yes, over there.
Hi, I work with adults with eating disorders, and I can see lots of analogies with some of the things you said about so people developing depression and issues around the competitive system and being over kind of used, and whether you think that perhaps there is a role with focused compassion therapy in people with eating disorder, in particular anorexia.
Yes, it's a wonderful question. So yes, there is a number of trials now that have been published using CFT, small groups, small numbers, not massive, big numbers, but nevertheless, RCTs are usually against TAU, treatment as usual, that sort of thing. And it's good, it's looking quite good, yes. There's a big study going on in Norway at the moment of CFT against CBT, so we're just waiting for that data to come out. I mean, the key thing for us is trying to, and the other thing is we're trying to do some fMRI studies to see if we really can, because of neuroplasticity and all that stuff, change some physiological systems, because we think that if you just try and do it all, psychology, without actually getting into the system, it's going to flounder a little bit. You've got to change the system a bit.
And can we thank Paul now for what's been an absolutely fascinating talk and inspiring in